The plains stretched as far as the eye could see, dry, cracked, and quiet beneath a pale morning sky. The wind carried dust across the Wyoming hills, whispering through brittle grass and the loose boards of an old wooden fence. A single figure moved among them, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a worn hat and the kind of silence that had become a habit. Ethan Cole had lived on this land his entire life. He'd been born here, learned to walk on its hard dirt, built his home with his own two hands. But lately, the ranch felt less like home and more like a graveyard of memories. His boots dragged a little slower each morning. His gaze lingered too long on the empty porch, on the rocking chair that never moved anymore, and on the faded scarf that hung from the corner of the fence. A splash of blue fluttering faintly in the wind. That scarf had belonged to her. To Lily. Every time the wind caught it, he could almost hear her laughter again, bright and young, echoing from somewhere he couldn't reach anymore. She'd been gone 6 years, taken by a road accident on a night he still replayed in his head. He'd buried her near the old apple tree and swore he'd keep the ranch going, because it was the only thing they'd built together. But the seasons had a way of wearing down even the strongest promises. The drought had stretched on for 2 years. The well ran lower each week, the fences leaned with age, and the bank letters piled up on the kitchen table like a slow, merciless countdown. Ethan was too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to leave, so he worked alone. He woke before dawn, worked through heat and pain, and spoke to no one but the horses and the occasional mailman. The silence had become his companion, heavy, predictable, and safe. That morning, he sat at the table with a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The sound of the ticking clock filled the house, steady and hollow. He didn't look at the empty chair across from him anymore, but he still set out 2 cups by habit. Old routines were hard to kill. When the knock came at the door, it startled him. He wasn't used to visitors. The mailman handed him an envelope, creased and stamped from a place he didn't recognize. Homestead Work Exchange Program, Denver. Ethan frowned, tore it open and read the letter slowly, lips moving slightly with each line. Our organization provides skilled help to rural ranchers and farmers in need, while also offering struggling individuals a chance to rebuild their lives through honest work. If you are interested in hosting a worker, please reply to confirm availability. All terms will be handled privately. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the words as though they were written in another language. Help. That was a word he hadn't used in years. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the fields. Weeds had taken over part of the western fence. The barn roof was missing a few shingles. The cattle were fewer than he remembered. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, rough with stubble, and let out a slow breath. He didn't really need a hand, not one that came from charity, but the thought of another winter alone, another year spent talking to ghosts, made something tighten in his chest. He sat back down, pulled a pen from the drawer, and signed the form. Fine, he muttered to himself. Let's see if company still feels like company. Days passed without another word. Ethan worked the land, fixed what he could, and tried not to think about it. Then, a week later, a letter arrived confirming that a worker had been assigned to his ranch. Her name was Clara Hale, age 27, available for immediate placement. No photo, no details, just a name and a date. He folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket, not sure what to make of it. Maybe she'd quit after a week like the last helper did. Maybe she wouldn't even come at all. That night, the sky burned orange over the plains. Ethan sat on the porch, a glass of water in hand, staring at the horizon as the sun sank into the earth. He could feel the weight of the coming change. He didn't know this woman. He didn't know what she'd bring. But for the first time in years, something in the silence shifted. A faint ripple of anticipation beneath the stillness. Inside, the old house creaked with the wind. The scarf fluttered again outside the window. Ethan looked toward it, his eyes softening. "Guess I'm really doing this," he said quietly. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Ethan hitched up the truck and drove into town for supplies. He didn't talk to anyone except the store clerk, who asked if he'd be coming to the harvest fair next month. Ethan shook his head. "Got enough company where I'm headed," he said, half a smile tugging at his lips. When he returned to the ranch that afternoon, the sky had turned dusty and pale. The air held that strange stillness that came before something changed. He stacked the feed bags, mended the broken latch on the barn door, and stood there for a long time, just watching the road that led up from the highway. He didn't even know what he was waiting for exactly, just that something was coming. As evening settled, he lit the porch lamp and sat down on the steps, elbows resting on his knees. The sound of distant thunder rolled low across the hills. He took off his hat, wiped his brow, and glanced once more at the scarf on the fence post. It fluttered gently, catching the fading light like a promise not yet broken. And then, far down the dirt road, he saw it. A small bus. Old, gray, kicking up a trail of dust as it wound its way toward the ranch. Ethan's heartbeat slowed. He stood, brushing the dust from his jeans, and squinted into the sunset. The closer the bus came, the more real it felt. This strange decision, this new chapter he hadn't asked for, but somehow needed. The bus came to a stop by the front gate with a hiss of brakes and a soft creak of metal. The door opened. A single figure stepped out. She was small, wearing a plain dress and holding a suitcase that looked too heavy for her frame. Her hair was tied back loosely, strands falling across her face as the wind picked up. She hesitated on the last step, glancing around the wide emptiness of the ranch as though it might swallow her whole. Ethan didn't move. He just stood there, one hand resting on the fence post, studying her silently. Finally, she looked up. Their eyes met for the briefest second, uncertain, cautious, but not empty. There was something there, something fragile. The driver shouted something, tossed her a small duffel, and the bus pulled away, leaving her alone in a cloud of dust. She turned slowly, clutching the suitcase to her chest. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the wind, moving through the dry grass like a whisper. Ethan cleared his throat. "You, Clara Hale?" She nodded. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir." He gestured toward the main house. "Cabin's out back. You'll find a bed and a stove. We start early." She hesitated again, then nodded and followed him quietly. The silence between them wasn't awkward, just heavy, like two people standing at the edge of something they didn't yet understand. When Ethan opened the door to the small cabin, she stepped inside and paused. Her eyes lingered on the simple furniture, the folded blanket on the cot, the window looking out toward the field. It wasn't much, but there was safety in its simplicity. He tipped his hat slightly. "I'll bring supper out later," she murmured. "Thank you." He turned to leave, but before he did, he glanced back. She was standing still, hands trembling slightly, eyes fixed on the floor. He stepped out, closed the door behind him, and stood on the porch as the last light faded from the sky. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The ranch fell quiet again, the same quiet he'd known for years. But it wasn't the same anymore. It felt expectant. Ethan looked toward the horizon, where the faint glow of the departing bus disappeared into the dark. Two lives, both scarred by silence, had just crossed paths on a lonely stretch of land. And though neither of them knew it yet, that meeting, that single dusty moment at dusk, would be the beginning of everything that would change them both forever. She woke before dawn, though she didn't mean to. The cabin was small and stubbornly quiet in a way that was nearly unbearable at first, a silence that pressed against her ears because it didn't carry the quick, nervous noises she was used to. No radio, no other footsteps, no muffled argument from the next room. Just the steady, distant breathing of the house and the faint sound of wind moving across the plains like an endless tide. Clara slid out of the cot and folded the blanket with hands that already felt practiced at being careful. The room smelled of old wood and starch from the folded quilts, and for a moment she let herself take the breath the air offered her. Here, breathing didn't have to be quick or apologetic. That alone was a small mercy, a quiet mercy she was honing into something like hope. She dressed slowly, because haste made her feel exposed. The denim shirt Ethan had left on the back of a chair for her fit loosely, a little like armor she could borrow for a morning. She smoothed back her hair with fingers that still trembled sometimes, and tucked the loose strands behind her ears, as if tucking away jumpy thoughts. The sun was only just lifting. It painted the edges of the horizon a thin, cold gold that promised heat later on. The world beyond the window looked unchanged and enormous, like a place where people could be swallowed or set free. She wasn't sure which it would be for her. Outside, the ranch moved with a rhythm she had never known but had watched from a distance in her dreams like a film for other people. A rooster called somewhere. The barn door creaked as a horse shifted its weight. Clara hesitated on the doorstep, hands on the jamb, listening for the sounds that would tell her she was not alone. And then she heard his voice. "Morning," Ethan said. Not loud, not warm, just present. He stood by the feed trough with a rag in his hand and a wide-brimmed hat in the crook of his arm. He always looked like he'd been carved from the same weathered wood as the fence posts. Steady, durable, something you could trust to stand through storms. She managed a nod. "Morning," she answered. The word felt small and thin in her throat. He didn't smile, but he didn't look at her with that measuring, suspicious look she'd come to expect from strangers either. He set the rag down and reached for a bucket, as if she were already part of the routine. He didn't ask questions. He offered work, which, she had learned long ago, was the safest kind of kindness. The first days settled into the hard, honest rhythm of physical labor. She rose with the light and walked the perimeter, shooed the cattle away from the leaner patches, hauled water when the well needed it. She learned the names of the horses by touch more than by word. There was comfort in the animals' straightforwardness. They didn't accuse or demand explanations. They were simply there, hungry or calm, and she could respond without telling them her story. Ethan taught her with the patient economy of someone who long ago decided words were for the necessary. He showed her the correct way to hold a rope, how to feel the give in a horse's flank, how to tie a hitch that won't slip. He corrected her once with a single quiet, "Loosen your hand." And she corrected herself, grateful that his corrections didn't come walloping with judgment. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch and listen to the creak of the house like an old man who remembered secrets but preferred not to share them. She watched him chop wood, feet steady on the log. She watched him mend a fence, braid wire until it was even and true. Watching him, she felt the odd tug of recognition, as if skill could be like a compass, pointing toward safety. He did not press her for conversation. When she offered something small, an extra bowl rinsed and left beside the sink, a pie baked from the ration she'd been given, he accepted it with that neutral gratitude that felt somehow more sincere than effusive praise. Even so, Clara's hands kept betraying her. Sometimes, while carrying a sack of feed, she'd flinch at a sudden noise. A distant vehicle, the slap of a horse's tail, as if each sound carried a memory. Once, while sweeping the kitchen, she knocked the broom against a jar, and the sound cracked like thunder. She found herself crouched on the floor, breath shallow, palms pressed to her knees, counting to 10 until the world felt less hostile. Ethan came into the kitchen in the next moment with 2 mugs of coffee and set one down in front of her without a word. The steam rose between them like a small truce. At night, she sat up with a pen and a stack of paper, writing letters she never sent. They were thin things at first, lists of places she wanted to see, recipes she'd practiced for the morning. And then they became sharper, loaded with a fear she had not yet dared to name. She tore them up, folded them into the wastebasket, then smoothed a fresh sheet out and wrote again. Sometimes she'd leave the papers by the bed and forget them until the next morning. One afternoon, she found one folded neatly and tucked under the hymn book on the windowsill. She had no memory of placing it there. Her skin went cold, then hot, then numb. She picked it up and read what she had written the night before. "I am not property. I am not a thing." It felt like a prayer, as much as a declaration. When she first arrived, she'd been careful to avoid looking at Ethan's face for long. Not because she didn't want to, but because she'd learned that long looks could start conversations she did not know how to finish. But slowly, in the pauses between her work, in the quiet for which neither asked anything of the other, she began to notice the small fissures that ran beneath his reserve. He would sometimes linger by the window, staring at the old scarf on the fence, as if tracing a map of loss that the rest of the world couldn't see. Once, when a hawk came circling above the fields, he mouthed the name Lily without realizing she was near. The word clung to the air like a ghost. She kept her questions small. "What do you feed the foals?" she would ask. "How often do the wires need tightening?" He answered with the same economy, and when conversation threatened to swell beyond the practical, he steered it back with a grunt and a schedule. Yet these small exchanges were not nothing. They were stitches. They were the kind of daily, mundane interactions that hold people together when the big things fall away. On the fourth morning, after the sun had warmed the earth and the horses had been fed, she came into the kitchen to find a mug waiting on the counter with a single note beneath it. "Coffee, the way you like it." She looked around expecting a camera or some trick. Ethan was in the yard, feeding the chickens. He glanced up and tipped his hat without coming inside. Clara picked up the mug. The coffee inside was black, with a hint of cinnamon. It was not how she'd liked it before, but it was good, hot, and offered with what felt like attention. She tucked the note into her pocket like a talisman. His kindness taught her that not every hand extended to her would try to fold her into ownership. Yet she could not unlearn the instincts of self-preservation. She carried folded phone numbers in her wallet, all emergency exits, all ways to disappear. She kept a small duffel packed at the back of the closet. She watched the road from the porch at night and mapped the angles of returning cars. When the wind moved certain ways, when a truck's brakes squealed, she felt the past rise in her throat like bile. One evening late, the two of them worked until the horizon bled into violet. They were returning from mending the fence where the wind had torn the top rail loose. Ethan moved with the slow, efficient motions of someone who knew exactly what to do. Clara watched him and felt the frailty of her own hands, the way they shook sometimes beneath a calloused exterior. A foal whinnied in the distance. She felt a tear gather uninvited in her eye and brushed it away without thinking. Ethan noticed. He didn't ask, as usual, but he did something he hadn't done before. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, folded packet of chewing tobacco and offered it to no one in particular. She had never seen him do small human gestures that belonged to everyday camaraderie. She refused, which might have been expected. Instead, she took it, more to steady her hands than to join in. "Keep it," he said gruffly, "for when the wind gets ugly." It was an awkward, clumsy way of offering solace. But that night, when the gusts howled and the windows rattled, Clara held the small packet more like a promise than anything else. She slept, finally, in a deep, exhausted kind of way that woke her the next morning with the first true sense of having rested since she could remember. The other people in the valley were curious at first. Ben and Lily from the next ranch over-waved when they saw her, their faces open and surprised. For a week, they offered to take her to town. She declined, content to learn the cadence of a life that gave her work and predictable demands. She was not ready to face crowds or markets or faces that might look at her with pity or speculation. The world inside the ranch felt contained enough to be bearable. The world outside felt too hungry. But small things kept changing. Clara found herself humming as she worked, a tune that belonged to no one, and yet fit the motion of skin and fiber and wood. She began to talk more to the horses, and sometimes to Ethan, in sentences that started with the weather and ended in something like confession. In the evenings, they sat on the porch together at a distance, both wrapped in their own blankets, and watched the sky turn indigo. He taught her the names of constellations, or, more precisely, he corrected her rough guesses and showed her where the handle of the Big Dipper bent. She listened and felt the sore places in her chest soften with the contour of a new mapping. One afternoon, while cleaning out the tack room, she found a small, tattered journal wedged behind an old saddle. The handwriting inside was quick and jagged, not unlike her own when she wrote in fits and starts during the sleepless nights. She read a few lines and faltered when she reached a passage about loss and the stubbornness of the land to keep memory. It was a piece of someone else's private life, and she put it back where she'd found it, hands steady for the first time. Yet the tremors didn't leave her completely. There were nights when she woke in a panic, convinced she heard a knock, and the sound of heavy boots that were not Ethan's. She would sit on the cot with her knees drawn in and whisper the name of a street she'd tried to forget. Sometimes she thought she heard a voice in her head saying, "You're not worth much." Sometimes the voice said, "Be quiet." And sometimes, when the night was very quiet, she could imagine the schematic of a hand reaching for her like a purchaser rather than a partner. Those hallucinations faded into the mundane when day came, but the hollows they carved inside her remained. Each morning, she returned to her tasks anyway. Routine was her anchor. The physical exhaustion of rope and feed and mending and scent of hay kept her from falling back into spinning thoughts. She began to call the horses by the names Ethan had taught her, and they responded in ways that felt like reciprocation. She pushed a wheelbarrow until the muscles in her forearms became maps of continuity. She learned to tie a double half-hitch without thinking about it. Each small mastery was a stitch in a life she was slowly beginning to trust. On the 12th day, while she was hanging a blanket to dry, Ethan approached from the field with a pair of gloves in his hand. The afternoon sun carved long shadows across the yard. He stopped within a few steps of her, close enough to be within speaking distance, and said, "You did good today." She paused, the blanket slipping a little from her fingers. "Thanks," she said, and the word was a small, brittle thing. He turned his head and looked at the horizon. "Don't try to be someone else for me," he added, not unkindly. "You do fine being you." She blinked. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She folded the blanket with more care than she had before and left it dangling over the rail to finish drying. When she went inside, she discovered a mug of coffee on the counter with a small spoon resting beside it. No note this time. Just the coffee. As if the world itself had decided she deserved a warm pause. That night, as she lay on her cot and listened to the wind move across the plains, she let her hands fall from the edge of the bed and imagined a future that did not include a hand holding her against her will. It was a ridiculous, indulgent imagining, but it seemed less ridiculous each day. A thought at first fragile began to bloom in the margins of her mind like a stubborn spring. Maybe this place, this unadorned stretch of land and the man who owned it, could be where something else, something kinder and truer, took root. At dawn, the next morning, from the porch, she watched the sunrise and for the first time felt it touching more than the horizon. The tremors were still there, like aftershocks, but softer, receding. In the kitchen, where the light angled across the worn table, she set 2 mugs out and left one for him, just as he had done for her. Then she boiled water and made coffee strong enough to taste like salvation. When Ethan stepped into the kitchen and nodded at the mug, Clara offered a timid smile. He looked at her for a long second, and she thought she saw something like approval flicker across his face. Not pity, not ownership, simply recognition. They did the work. The days were long. The nights carried more sleep, and in the spaces between feed and fence and the careful tilt of the sun, a fragile trust began to bud, bright as the first green after a drought. The snow on the mountains had long melted into the valleys, turning the earth into thick, rich soil. The sun rose earlier now, scattering pale light over the pastures where dew clung to each blade of grass like glass beads. The ranch had begun to breathe again. The horses moved more freely, the cattle grazed closer to the fences, and the land itself seemed to hum with quiet life. Clara had grown used to the rhythm of the days. It had taken time, but the ranch no longer felt like a strange country she'd wandered into. It felt like a place that accepted her presence without judgment. Every morning she would step outside the cabin, stretch her arms toward the horizon, and inhale that crisp, dusty air. It always smelled faintly of hay and the ghost of rain, a scent that had become her comfort. Ethan was already working most mornings when she woke. He never made a point of greeting her with cheer. He simply tipped his hat in acknowledgement, his way of saying good morning. She had come to recognize that gesture as one of respect. It meant more than words could manage. Over the weeks, something delicate began to grow between them. Not love, not yet, but a kind of understanding that softened the edges of their silence. They worked side by side in the barn, mending saddles, oiling tools, stacking hay. She learned the small sounds that belonged to the place. The hum of flies, the slap of ropes, the low rolling grunts of cattle. And through those sounds, she started to sense the way Ethan moved through the world. Slow, deliberate, never wasting motion or speech. One morning, while they were fixing a fence out by the north field, she caught herself humming under her breath. It was a tune she didn't recognize, maybe something her mother used to sing when she was a child. Ethan paused mid-swing of his hammer and glanced at her. She froze, embarrassed, thinking she'd disturbed him. "Keep going," he said quietly. "It sounds peaceful." It was such a small remark, but it lodged deep inside her. He didn't say beautiful or sweet, or any of those words men sometimes used when they wanted something. He said peaceful. And for Clara, peace was something rare, something sacred. After that day, she hummed often while she worked, and Ethan didn't stop her. Sometimes she thought she caught him listening. Not smiling exactly, but softer around the eyes. They began sharing small pieces of conversation about weather, crops, the cost of feed, and occasionally about things neither of them could change. He told her once about the apple tree near the house, the one with a rope swing half buried in weeds. "My wife planted that tree," he said, his voice calm but distant. "Said we'd have a daughter who'd swing on it someday." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. Later, when he wasn't looking, she went to that tree and cleared the weeds herself. It wasn't pity. It was respect for a love she could feel in the way he spoke of it. In the evenings, when the work was done, she sometimes lingered on the porch instead of retreating to her cabin. Ethan would sit across from her, both of them wrapped in their own quiet thoughts. The world around them glowed orange and gold in the last light of day. She'd watch the sun bleed into the horizon while Ethan whittled small bits of wood into shapes he never kept. Horses, birds, stars, leaving them scattered across the railing. One evening she asked, "Why carve something if you're just going to throw it away?" He shrugged. "Not everything's meant to stay." She thought about that long after the stars came out. Maybe he wasn't talking about the carvings at all. It was sometime in late spring when Ethan found her playing the guitar in the barn. She hadn't meant for him to hear. She thought he was still in the house. The guitar was old and missing a string, but the sound it made was warm and fragile, like sunlight filtered through dust. She sang softly, almost whispering the words. Ethan stood outside the door for a long while, listening. When she finished, he stepped in quietly. She jumped a little, startled, but he just nodded. "You play well," he said. She looked down at the guitar, fingers still resting on the strings. "It's been a long time." He didn't ask her who taught her or why she stopped. He just said, "Don't stop again." That night, Clara wrote in one of her letters, the ones she never mailed, "He listens without taking pieces of me." Maybe that's what kindness is. Not the big things, but the small spaces where you're allowed to exist without fear. Summer rolled in fast, and with it came long days and heavy work. Together, they fixed fences, branded cattle, and repaired the windmill that had stopped turning. Clara's hands grew rougher, but her movements grew more certain. Ethan noticed the difference. The confidence in the way she held a rope, the way she no longer flinched when the horses snorted or thunder cracked in the distance. One afternoon, while they worked under the heat, Ethan handed her a water canteen. Their fingers brushed. It was the lightest touch, accidental, but it sent a quiet jolt through both of them. He cleared his throat and looked away. She pretended not to notice, though her pulse quickened. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was the realization that she could touch someone and not be afraid. That night, as she lay on her cot staring at the ceiling, she thought of that moment again and again. How ordinary it had been. How safe. Weeks passed, and with every passing day the space between them shrank a little more. They began to share dinner at the main house. Clara cooked most nights, experimenting with what little they had. Ethan never commented on the taste, but she could tell when he liked something because he'd finish the plate completely and pour her an extra cup of coffee afterward. One evening, she made apple cobbler using the few apples left from the tree near the barn. When she served it, Ethan stared at it for a moment longer than usual. "Haven't had this since." He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he took a bite. A small smile tugged at his lips. "It's good." Clara felt something in her chest unclench, something she hadn't realized was tight. Later that night, she sat on the porch while Ethan cleaned the tools. The air smelled of rain and warm earth. Without thinking, she said, "I cleared the weeds around your tree." He stopped, the rag frozen in his hand. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," she said quietly. "It's a good tree. Strong roots, he nodded, eyes glinting faintly in the lamplight. Yeah, it's still standing. Neither spoke again after that, but the silence wasn't cold. It was filled with everything neither of them could say out loud. The next morning, Ethan left a single apple on her porch. No note. No explanation. She smiled for the first time in months. A smile that reached her eyes. As summer deepened, storms started rolling through the valley, brief but fierce. They brought sudden wind and flashes of lightning that lit up the sky like veins of fire. Clara used to fear storms. The sound of thunder once made her curl up, hands pressed to her ears, waiting for something terrible to happen. But on this ranch, storms didn't come with yelling voices or slammed doors. They came with the smell of wet dirt and the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof. One night, a storm hit harder than usual. The wind rattled the windows and made the barn doors groan. Clara rushed outside to check the horses, the rain soaking through her clothes in seconds. She struggled to fasten the latch when Ethan appeared beside her, holding a lantern. "Go back inside!" he shouted over the wind. She shook her head. "They're spooked!" Together they worked, moving fast, calming the animals until the worst passed. By the time they were done, both were drenched, mud streaking their boots. Ethan looked at her, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes bright, and something inside him shifted. He saw not the frightened woman who'd stepped off that bus weeks ago, but someone strong, brave, alive. "You did good," he said, voice low. Clara smiled, teeth chattering slightly. "We did good." When they finally stepped back into the house, Ethan handed her a towel. The room smelled faintly of wet wool and coffee. She dried her face, then looked at him. "You don't talk much," she said softly, "but when you do, it matters." He hesitated, then met her gaze. "Same could be said for you." That exchange lingered between them like the echo of thunder long after the storm had passed. The days that followed felt lighter, quieter in a different way. Trust had crept in, slow and unnoticed, until it became part of everything they did. She no longer avoided his eyes. He no longer hesitated before speaking her name. And though neither dared to define what was forming between them, they both knew something had changed. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the fields shimmered gold, Ethan watched her from the porch as she guided a young horse into the paddock. She moved with gentle certainty, her voice calm, her hands steady. He realized then that she didn't just belong on the ranch. She was saving it, piece by piece, just by being there. Clara felt his gaze and turned, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "What?" she asked, smiling faintly. He shook his head. "Nothing. Just glad you're here." It was the first time he'd said anything like that aloud. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to still. The air, the light, even the hum of crickets. Clara's smile deepened. "Me too." That night she wrote in her letter again. "For the first time in years, I don't want to run. Maybe the heart remembers how to stay." And somewhere beyond the open window, the wind moved gently through the apple tree, scattering its petals across the grass. A quiet promise of what was still to come. The first signs of autumn came quietly. The mornings grew colder, the light sharper, the grass brittle beneath the boots. Each day began with a pale mist that rolled off the fields and wrapped itself around the fences like breath. Clara loved those mornings. The air felt clean, as if it washed away what had come before. She worked faster now, her body strong from months of labor, her heart steadier than she ever remembered. Ethan noticed it too. She laughed more easily, spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had learned her own worth through work rather than words. He caught himself watching her sometimes, the way she braided her hair before tending the horses, or how she paused at the gate each evening to watch the sky. She had become part of the ranch's rhythm, the missing note that had made all the silence feel too loud. It had been 4 months since she arrived, and in that time, the quiet between them had changed shape. It no longer pressed down, it breathed, it held warmth. But peace has a way of drawing shadows toward it, as if the world cannot bear stillness for too long. The first shadow came in the form of a letter. It arrived in town, delivered to the post office with Ethan's name on it, but written in a hand he didn't recognize. He picked it up on his way back from selling feed, tucking it into his jacket without reading it until he was home. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd once signed the form that brought Clara to him. The paper smelled faintly of cologne, sharp and foreign. The message was short. "She belongs to me. You've got something of mine. I'll be there soon to collect it." There was no name, but Ethan didn't need one. He'd heard fragments of Clara's story, enough to piece together the kind of man who would write such words. He folded the paper carefully, slid it into a drawer, and sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. The clock ticked. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind began to rise. That evening, Clara noticed the change in him. He was quieter than usual, distant in a way that made her chest tighten. She asked if something was wrong, and he shook his head. "Just tired," he said. She didn't press. She'd learned to give space where words wouldn't fit. But Ethan couldn't sleep that night. The thought of someone coming to take her, to hurt her, stirred something he hadn't felt in years. Not just anger, a deep, fierce instinct to protect. He stood at the window, watching the moonlight pool across the fields, and realized how much she had come to mean to him. 3 days later, the past arrived in a truck coated in dust and arrogance. Clara was in the barn brushing down one of the mares when she heard the engine. It was an unfamiliar sound, harsh, impatient. Her hands froze on the brush. Every muscle in her body went rigid. Ethan stepped out of the house, wiping his hands on a rag. The truck door slammed, and a man climbed out. He was broad-shouldered, with a slick smile and eyes that didn't look at the land but at what could be taken from it. "Afternoon," the man said, striding forward like he owned the ground. "Name's Doran. I'm here for Clara Hale." Ethan didn't answer. His face gave nothing away, but his stance changed. He straightened, set his jaw, and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Doran smirked, mistaking it for hesitation. "She didn't tell you, huh? She's under contract. Owes me a good bit of money. You can check the papers if you like." He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket and waved it lazily. Ethan didn't look at it. "She doesn't owe you anything." The man laughed. "That's where you're wrong. I paid for her ticket out here. She works for me until I say she doesn't." By then, Clara had appeared at the barn door. She didn't mean to. Her body moved before her mind could stop it. The sight of Doran froze her blood. Her hands trembled so violently that the brush fell from her grasp and landed in the straw. Doran turned toward her, smiling like a predator. "There you are, sweetheart. Thought you could run forever?" Ethan moved between them before the man could take another step. His voice was steady, cold as iron. "You'll leave my land, now." Doran's smile faltered. "You're making a mistake, friend." "Not your friend," Ethan said, "and she's not your property." For a moment, everything was still, the wind, the birds, even the air. Then Doran took a slow step back, eyes narrowing. "You think this ends because you say so?" Ethan didn't flinch. "It ends here." Doran looked past him at Clara. "You'll regret this," he said. "Both of you." Then he spat on the dirt, climbed back into his truck, and drove off, the tires spitting gravel as he went. When the sound of the engine finally faded, Clara's knees gave out. She sank into the straw, shaking uncontrollably. Ethan turned and knelt beside her, but didn't reach out. He knew enough not to touch her until she allowed it. "He can't hurt you," he said quietly. Her breath came in ragged bursts. "You don't understand. He always finds a way." "Not here." She lifted her head, eyes red and wild. "He owns the papers, Ethan. I signed them. I thought I was buying freedom, but it was just another cage." Ethan shook his head. "Paper doesn't make a person a slave." But she didn't believe him. Not yet. The years had taught her that words were promises made to be broken. For the next few days, the ranch was heavy with tension. Clara worked in silence, moving like someone who had been carved from glass, brittle and ready to break. She jumped at every sound. A slammed door, a snapping branch, even the barking of dogs. Ethan watched her, helpless in the face of fear he couldn't erase with reason. One night, he found her sitting by the fence, staring at the road. The moonlight made her look almost translucent, like she might vanish if he blinked. He walked up quietly and stood beside her. Neither spoke for a long while. Finally, she said, "You should let me go." "No. If he comes back." "He won't," Ethan interrupted. "But even if he does, you're not leaving. You've got a place here." She turned to look at him, her expression caught between disbelief and exhaustion. "Why are you doing this?" He hesitated. The answer was simple, but saying it out loud felt dangerous. "Because you deserve peace." Her throat tightened. "And what if peace doesn't exist for people like me?" He met her gaze steadily. "Then we make it." Something inside her broke then, not in pain, but in release. The tears came quietly, and when they did, Ethan did the only thing he could. He sat beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence, but not so close as to trap her. They stayed that way until dawn, saying nothing, watching the first light spill over the land. The next morning, Clara woke to find a small lockbox on the porch. Inside was the letter Ethan had received and the torn contract she'd once signed. He'd burned the rest of it, leaving only the ashes folded inside. A single note lay on top, written in Ethan's careful, deliberate hand. "You're free here. Don't forget it." She pressed the note to her chest, breathing deeply, letting the truth of it sink in. Weeks passed without any sign of Doran. But even as the fear faded, something new took its place. A fragile kind of hope. Clara began to smile again. She sang softly to the horses. Ethan caught himself humming along once or twice, though he would never admit it. Then came the storm. It rolled in without warning one evening. Dark clouds swelling over the hills like bruises. The wind howled, snapping branches, rattling windows. The air smelled of electricity and rain. Ethan and Clara raced to the barn to secure the animals before the worst hit. Lightning split the sky, followed by a crack of thunder so loud it shook the ground. The horses panicked, thrashing against their stalls. Clara moved among them with fearless urgency, speaking softly, her voice a calm current amid chaos. Ethan worked beside her, tying ropes, securing latches. When another bolt struck nearby, the barn door blew open with a crash. One of the foals bolted toward the storm, terrified. Without thinking, Clara ran after it, disappearing into the rain. "Clara!" Ethan shouted, but the wind swallowed her name. He grabbed a lantern and followed, his heart pounding. The rain was relentless, soaking through his clothes, turning the ground to mud. He found her near the creek, struggling to free the foal whose rope had tangled around a broken fence post. "Let me," he started, but she shook her head. "I've got him," she shouted back, pulling at the knot with trembling hands. Her hair was plastered to her face, her eyes fierce. Lightning flashed again, close enough to paint the world white. The thunder that followed made her flinch, but she didn't stop. When the rope finally came loose, the foal bolted toward the barn. Clara swayed on her feet, breathless. Ethan caught her before she fell. Her body trembled against his, cold and soaked through. He carried her back, every step heavy but certain. Inside the barn, he set her down by the fire he'd managed to start in the old stove. She was shivering uncontrollably. He draped a blanket over her shoulders and crouched beside her. "You could have been killed," he said, voice rough with fear he didn't want to show. She looked up at him, eyes soft and wet. "I couldn't let it die." He met her gaze for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, "You're shaking." "I know." He reached out slowly, carefully, and took her hand in his. "You're safe," he said. The trembling didn't stop right away, but her breathing steadied. The thunder outside began to fade, replaced by the gentle sound of rain on the roof. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the past pulling her under. Ethan sat beside her until the fire burned low, neither of them speaking, the silence between them no longer heavy but whole. When morning came, the sky was clear again, washed clean. The ranch stood, battered but unbroken. Clara stepped outside, the air sharp and cool against her skin. She looked toward the horizon where the storm had vanished, and for the first time, she felt something she hadn't dared to believe in. freedom. And somewhere behind her, Ethan's voice carried softly through the morning air. "Coffee's on?" She turned, smiling, and the world, at last, felt steady beneath her feet. The morning after the storm broke clear and cold, as if the sky itself had been scrubbed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and ash from the old stove that had burned through the night. The world outside the barn glimmered in shades of silver and gold. Water pooled in the furrows between rows of grass, and the mountains on the horizon looked close enough to touch. For the first time in months, the land felt alive again. Clara stood at the doorway, wrapped in Ethan's coat. It was too large for her, the sleeves rolled up past her wrists, the collar heavy against her neck, but the warmth clung to her like safety. Steam still rose from the fields, curling around her boots as she stepped into the light. The quiet after the storm was almost holy. Behind her, the horses moved restlessly, shaking the damp from their manes. Ethan was checking the stalls, counting the animals one by one, his voice low and steady. She watched him for a while before she spoke. "All of them made it?" He looked up and nodded. "Every last one." She exhaled, relief flooding her face. He saw it and felt a strange ache in his chest. Pride, maybe, or something deeper he hadn't yet learned how to name. They spent the rest of the morning clearing debris. The storm had taken down part of the west fence and scattered tools across the yard. The sun climbed higher, drying the mud into cracked patterns that caught on the soles of their boots. They worked side by side, their movements quiet, practiced, almost wordless. At one point, Clara paused to wipe sweat from her brow, and Ethan caught himself staring again. She didn't notice. She was humming under her breath, the same melody she'd once played on that old guitar in the barn. By midday, they'd mended enough of the damage to call it a victory. Clara leaned against the fence, drinking from the tin cup he handed her. The water was cold and tasted faintly of metal. She tilted her head back, letting the sunlight touch her face. "Feels different," she said. Ethan took a sip and nodded. "Storms usually do that, strip everything down to what matters." She smiled faintly. "Guess that's not a bad thing." He watched her for a long moment. There was color in her cheeks again, a lightness in her posture. The woman who had once trembled at every noise now stood before him, steady as the ground beneath them. He didn't say it, but the sight of her filled something in him that had been empty for years. The days that followed were gentle. The storm had brought ruin, yes, but also renewal. The grass grew greener, the creek ran fuller, and the air held the clean scent of rain long after the clouds had gone. Clara seemed to bloom with the land. She spent her mornings tending the horses and her evenings walking along the fence line, fingers brushing the tall grass, as if she were reacquainting herself with the world. Ethan began joining her on those walks without invitation. They rarely spoke. It wasn't necessary. Words felt too small for the quiet understanding that had settled between them. Sometimes he'd hand her an apple from the tree she'd rescued. She'd take it, polish it on her sleeve, and split it neatly in half to share. The simple ritual became theirs. One evening, near dusk, they sat on the porch watching a herd of elk move along the far ridge. The sky burned orange behind them, streaked with thin clouds that caught fire in the dying light. Clara leaned forward, elbows on her knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly. Ethan shook his head. "Used to. Not anymore." Why, he thought about it. Because leaving doesn't fix what's broken. Sometimes you've got to stay put long enough for the land, or yourself, to heal. Clara turned to look at him. The fading sunlight caught her eyes, and he saw the question there. She didn't dare speak aloud. "And you?" he asked softly. "You ever think about leaving?" She hesitated. "I used to think running was the only way to survive. But now—" She trailed off, glancing toward the barn where the lantern light flickered. "Now I think maybe I've run enough." Ethan's throat tightened, but he didn't reply. He just nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if sealing a promise neither of them needed to say out loud. When the air turned cold, he stood and went inside to fetch blankets. Clara stayed on the porch, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the creak of the windmill, the chirp of night insects, the low sigh of cattle settling in for the evening. When he returned, he draped one of the blankets over her shoulders. She looked up, surprised by the gesture, but before she could speak, he said, "It gets colder after dark." She smiled. "You always think ahead." "Habit," he said. He sat beside her again, and for a long while they said nothing. The stars began to appear one by one, sharp and white against the black. Clara traced the pattern of them with her eyes. "Do you know the names of all of them?" she asked. "Used to," Ethan replied. "My father taught me. The big one there is Vega, brightest star in the Lyra constellation." "What about that one?" He followed her gaze. "Altair? And that one?" "Deneb. Together they make the summer triangle." She nodded, committing the names to memory. "It's strange," she said after a moment. "I used to think the stars looked lonely. Now they just look patient." He turned his head, studying her profile in the starlight. "Patience suits you." Her laugh was quiet but real. "I'm learning." The next morning came with soft fog and the distant sound of the creek still running full. Ethan was in the barn when he heard her singing again, that same low tune, clear and steady. He leaned against the doorframe, listening. When she finished, she looked up and saw him there. "Didn't mean to wake you," she said. "You didn't," he replied. "Keep going." She shook her head, embarrassed. "It's silly." "No. It's good to hear the ranch alive again." She smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her smile reached all the way to her eyes. That afternoon, they rode out to check the far pasture. The horses moved easily under them, their hooves cutting through the softened dirt. The air carried the smell of sage and wildflowers. Clara rode ahead, her braids swinging down her back. Ethan watched her silhouette against the sun and felt a strange peace settle over him. The ghosts that had haunted him, Lily's laughter, the emptiness of the house, the years of silence, all seemed quieter now. They stopped by the ridge where the land dropped into a shallow valley. From there, they could see everything: the fences, the fields, the glint of water winding through the grass. Clara dismounted and walked to the edge, looking out. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Ethan joined her. "It's home." The word hung between them, simple but powerful. She turned to him slowly. "Home," she repeated, tasting it as if testing whether it fit. When their eyes met, something passed between them. Not sudden, not fiery, but deep and certain. It was the quiet recognition of two people who had spent too long alone and finally found someone who understood the language of silence. They stood like that for a long time, the wind tugging gently at their clothes. Then Clara said almost to herself, "You paid for me once, but I think you gave me more than you owed." Ethan looked at her, his voice low. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," she smiled softly. "That's what makes it real." They rode back in silence, the kind of silence that carried peace instead of fear. When they reached the barn, the sky had turned violet. The apple tree near the house glowed faintly in the twilight, its branches heavy with fruit. Clara dismounted first and reached up to pluck one. She held it out to him. "For the road," she said. He took it, brushed his thumb over the skin, and nodded. "Thank you." "Thank you," she replied. Later that night, after she'd gone to her cabin, Ethan sat on the porch, staring at the apple in his hand. He thought of Lily, of the promises he'd made and broken, of the years spent trying to outrun grief. He set the apple on the railing and leaned back, closing his eyes. For the first time in years, his heart didn't feel like a burden. Inside her cabin, Clara wrote her last letter. She didn't write it to the past this time, or to fear, or to ghosts. She wrote it to the land, to the man who had given her shelter, to the part of herself she'd thought was lost. "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." She folded the paper neatly, placed it in the drawer, and blew out the lamp. The wind outside rustled the leaves of the apple tree like a whisper. In the quiet that followed, the ranch seemed to exhale. Two souls, once broken, breathing in rhythm again. The stars burned steady above, not lonely but patient, watching as the ranch healed itself, one small act of kindness at a time. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand gestures. It comes quietly, like dawn breaking after a long storm. Ethan and Clara didn't save each other with promises or passion, but with patience, kindness, and the courage to stay when running seemed easier. In the stillness of the Wyoming plains, they learned that healing isn't about forgetting the past. It's about finding someone who helps you face it without fear. Because sometimes, the truest kind of love is the one that teaches your heart how to be still and free again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles, where every tale brings the spirit of the frontier to life with stories of love, loss, and redemption beneath endless western skies. Saddle up, hit that subscribe button, and join us for the next journey, because love always rides again. White Heart Rice Plant.